Hello, and a very warm welcome back to Introduction to International Relations. For this 8th session, we're going to be looking at post-structuralism. And before I go into the slides, I just want to say a pat on the back to you for the great deal of ground that we've covered, the range of different theoretical and conceptual approaches. And this presentation, post-structuralism, is the last of the different IR theories that we're going to be touching upon. And this, now that we've covered all of this ground, this should stand you in good stead, not only for this module and your subsequent presentations of how you're going to apply theory to case studies and so on and so forth, but it should stand you in good stead for the rest of your international relations degree and for your future, whatever it means in terms of public policy, going on to take a master's, that we've covered a great deal of theoretical and conceptual ground. Now, without further ado, I want to share the screen again with you. And again, I start off with an image, or images, I should say, in this case, as I'm wont to do and have done up until this point in Introduction to International Relations. So post-structuralism is the approach that we're going to be looking at here, or theoretical framework. And here you can see three images of the same political actor, and it's of course Tony Blair, the new Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1997 to 2007, winning 3 general elections, modernising the Labour Party, and in many ways, at least up until the Iraq War, seen as a popular leader, and so on and so forth, at least in the domestic space. Of course, the Iraq War is something that has dented Tony Blair's reputation, legacy, and so on and so forth. But the key point here is a political actor working within a particular social space. And these 3 images, so I could use text, but here I want to show you images, are a representation of a particular social reality. So if you look at the left image of Tony Blair, seen here as a serious, one could argue from looking at this image, a statesman, someone in command of his audience, confident, etc., etc. A representation of Tony Blair that many have agreed with or bought into, whatever the case might be. The middle image is an image that's used in a much, much, much more critical light of Tony Blair and referring to him as a war criminal or something of him going to, let's say, defend himself in The Hague at the International Criminal Court, whatever this case is. You've got another representation, perhaps not a representation that you see often amongst mainstream broadcasters, but an image that, let's say, is in the particular discourse around Tony Blair, especially in the March 2003 context of his leading role in the eventual US-UK invasion of Iraq, March 2003, which went against the UN Security Council, who voted against it. So hence wasn't part of international law, but nonetheless the US, the UK invaded, and for a number of reasons, Blair is portrayed as a war criminal in this image. Again, I'm not going to say whether Tony Blair is a good, wonderful statesman or a war criminal. This is not the point of this images. It's just to show you how a particular reality, how a particular actor is represented, how different actors represent themselves. What we take for granted is something that post-structuralists say there's not necessarily one truth, and we have to therefore challenge how we see a particular actor, and so on and so forth. The third image is of Tony Blair, the family man, with his son. And so a more benign image of him. But again, there's, from a political context, there's a politicization going on with this image. It's showing a benign, caring man, and therefore something that perhaps a representation of this figure, this prime minister, of how he would want to take care of the British public, and more broadly, when it comes to international relations, the UK's relations with others, doing something good in the world, according to Blair and people around him. And post-structuralist thinking looks at how there are multiple truths, multiple meanings that are given, and at any given stage, one meaning can become dominant, but it's not something that's in the social world is something that's objective forever. So one thing I should say before I go into the slides of post-structuralism is that it's not to say that this is a critique sometimes of post-structuralist or postmodernist thought, that actually certain events never took place, and post-structuralists are it's all about ideas and events don't take place. No, the Second World War, the horrors of the Holocaust, the Cold War, whatever the case, these events certainly did take place. But the meaning and the representation and the narrative we give to certain events that take place is heavily contested and heavily politicized. So again, you look at the cultural wars, so to speak, in the United States around COVID-19, wearing a mask. That is the meaning, and different political actors, to use US political discourse, more conservative or more liberal, creates a particular meaning of what is the right and appropriate way to respond to this public health crisis. So again, I prefer to post-structuralism as post-structuralist thought and IR as a theoretical framework. Well, arguably and post-structuralists themselves don't like to see themselves as creating a new theoretical framework, because then it says a way of certain, let's say, approaches of how a theory therefore starts to inform how we should do international relations. Post-structuralist tends to take a more critical approach and says there's not, whether we're talking about realism or liberalism or Marxism or feminism, critical theory, each of these approaches in different ways, and I simplify, of course, they are being normative and prescriptive. They're saying this is what we should do. Post-structuralist tends to say, okay, let's be more critical of what's around us, and not necessarily say we should do A or B, but just always be on the lookout for anything that can create more violence or hierarchies, inequalities, etc. in the world. Post-structuralism in this sense is sometimes critiqued because it doesn't have an obvious position, and therefore it's circular in that sense and is de facto very conservative. But post-structuralists would respond, actually, it's this idea that we always have to be prescriptive and say what we should do that is often what leads to problems in the world. Important thinkers, not IR scholars, but important thinkers, particularly in the post-Second World War context, French scholars like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, are major thinkers who have influenced IR post-structuralist thought over the last 30, 40 years. And I refer to Judith Butler, a very important thinker, post-structuralist feminist thinker. She's another important thinker whose work has hugely influenced again, post-structuralist thought, IR thought. Here we've got, you can see, whether it's with constructivism or critical theory, but also with post-structuralism, and feminism as well. In the 1980s, the last stage of the Cold War, you can see how these more critical approaches are challenging more mainstream approaches like realism and liberalism. And again, in the 1980s, it was a response to the dominance of realism or structural realism, Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics, 1979, challenging this notion that everything is state-centric, and actually that you can say that there's, according to structural realists, it's all about states and their interaction with others within an anarchical system. That's problematic, according to thinkers like Ashley, Shapiro, and so forth. Why? Because it reproduces a particular order, a particular hierarchy, and it basically simplifies the complexity of societies, how societies produce meaning and create whether, let's say, amongst political elites, create certain meanings, representations of how they want to interact with them, but not only with those in their own society, but with others. And it's this binary distinction that post-structuralists are critical of, that you have to show how each of these factors are related to one another. But often, as we can see, political actors like to see themselves in a positive light and represent others in a negative light, us versus them, so to speak. And this is again where post-structuralists say, be on guard. Always try to think how things are politicized, how they're created within a particular social space. So it challenges, and again, the 1980s, but going over the last 40 up to 40 years from let's say the early 1980s to the present, how we can see that the state-centric approach that realists go on about, it privileges a particular order, a particular more conservative order that post-structuralists are critical of, and also is a cause of, or a factor in how it makes possible that there is violence in this world. So when we think of let's say, violence, political violence, often in the world we live in, we think of non-state actors, transnational actors, and we'll be looking again at these images below to talk about, let's say, terrorist actors, so actors like Al-Qaeda. But as we know, historically, politically, it's state actors that have often been violent, not only to their own citizens, but also to others. And that's still the case. And therefore, we need to think much more critically about this politico-military aspect of states, how security is done, because it's often problematic, and it often is a feature in, again, why violence takes place. So it creates more disorder rather than order, which political actors, state actors say that if we do it this way, we'll create more stability and order. Often, and this is where post-structuralist is another critical approach, they're skeptical of this because it's often these state actors saying one thing, but the social reality is that more, let's say, violence takes place, and so on. Now, as we can see, that this notion of representation becomes important. And so danger, when we think of danger, when we think of, let's say, notions of terrorism, we now think of non-state actors. But this is something that was created, let's say, in different historical time periods. So in the modern context, very contemporary events, the events of 9/11. So the events of 9/11 could have been understood, represented in a range of different ways. But the hegemonic discourse, the language and practice that flowed from it, created, how made possible by George W. Bush's administration and other political actors, media outlets, was that actually it was not only an evil act that killed 3,000 innocent people, post-structuralists would accept that argument, but actually the 3,000 innocent people, it was done by a particular transnational actor. Fine, there's evidence for that, Al-Qaeda network. But how do we respond? What's the meaning that we give? Okay, we have a choice here as political actors. If we refer something as a war on terror, that creates particular meaning, particular structures, particular institutions. So the global war on terror, GWOT, was something that was created in response to this event. We know that there are events around the world where innocent people are killed for political and other reasons. But it doesn't necessarily deem such a strong response. Of course, it's the case that it's in New York or Washington, D.C. or Pennsylvania, and therefore, but against the world superpower by a non-state actor. But nonetheless, the point made here by post-structuralists and other critical approaches is that it was made in a highly politicized way by the Bush administration to create fear, to create threat. So it created the possibility for how the United States could, let's say, operationalize its foreign policy in the greater Middle East. And there's no conspiracy to this. It's more in a sense that this particular actors, the Bush administration in this case, one could even maybe argue that the Bush administration believe in what they're doing. They created it because they wanted to actually create a better world order according to their belief systems. But nonetheless, and this is the key thing you have to think of when you think of post-structuralism, it's the meaning and events that are given to something where eventually we take them for granted. This is something that we have to always bear in mind, that it's not something from nature, it's something that's arbitrary. And we have to think and critique and always be ready to deconstruct and be skeptical of certain institutions and events and let's say, institutions that have been created, and to recreate it here, I'm going to be normative, in a way that lessens, let's say, instability, violence, and other factors in this world of ours. Post-structuralists, again, as I've emphasized, don't come up with some broad approach, normative approach of what we should do, but they are critical of what it is that is taking place. And they're, in a sense, their own commitment there is to actually lessen the problems in this world of ours, in this complicated world of ours. The image on the right-hand side, of course, is of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And the reason why I put this image here was because in the post-9/11 context, George W. Bush's State of the Union address after 9/11 attacks 2002 was looking at axis of evil. So his relationship, forgive me, I think it was 2003. I would need to look this up, so forgive me. But the point is that George W. Bush, after 9/11, had some sort of relationship with key actors in the Middle East and elsewhere, including with Iran. But we now know subsequently his State of the Union address, where he referred to Iraq for the impeding Iraq War of March 2003, Iran, so two Middle Eastern countries, and North Korea as the axis of evil, having relations, but also relations with non-state actors, and the possibility of one of these evil actors, according to the Bush administration, passing on weapons of mass destruction to a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda, and the calamity that this would be for the United States, the Western world, civilization itself, etc., etc. North Korea, the same actor, the same leadership. Okay, the father, Kim Jong-il, was the leader at the time. We have Kim Jong-un. But broadly speaking, the same leadership, the same actor, North Korea I'm referring to now. Fast forward 15, 20 years, and you have the Trump administration. Also, nominally speaking, at least, a Republican politician, so the same party even, representing North Korea in a very different light. The actor itself, North Korean, and who it is, has not radically changed, but nonetheless, how it's represented by the Trump administration and therefore Washington representation of North Korea has changed. So we have to think of how political actors politicize, why they deem certain ones, to use constructivist language here, as friends or enemies, and how this privileges a certain approach and let's say creates a certain fear, or creates possibly a more harmonious aspect. And what I'm not doing here is referring to Kim Jong-un in one light or the other. I mean, there's certain categories to refer to it as a dictatorship is correct on the political science terminology, but as a dictatorship, which it is clearly, Kim Jong-un, and to give my own, let's say, language here, a totalitarian regime, North Korea. But the point I want to emphasize is that different political actors in Washington at different points in time have represented the same actor in a different way. So we can see that reality in the social context is more fluid. And this is where discourse becomes important, language and practices. So a few elements of post-structuralism that I want to emphasize is that language is not some neutral transmitter. It creates particular meanings, and it creates certain approaches of how we do politics, how we relate to one another, how we see each other. If I refer to you or something as very dangerous, and I can convince others in constructivist language, then over time it becomes a reality. Or I can refer to you in a much more positive light. But we can see it's not neutral. And again, language, therefore, is front and center. Language and images, so this discourse, language and practices. I showed you the images of Tony Blair and just the images of the 9/11 attacks and Trump and Kim Jong-un. So it's both images and language, but we can see that language is created. So when you look at how political actors refer to another actor, you look at, let's say, speeches made, memorandums, etc., etc. It creates a possibility for a particular public policy, for a particular approach. And how we understand events, how we understand things is created within a particular social space. If in the case of, let's say, a migration crisis, 2015, if in Germany, let's say, the crisis taking place in the Mediterranean, the Syrian civil war, what have you, and it creates an influx of migrants, how is it seen? Well, in some cases, some politicians, some non-state actors, some broadcasters, it's represented in a positive light, and in other cases, a very negative light. But again, how we see it as the audience and how we let's say, see certain things being represented creates a particular reality where eventually we have certain beliefs about it. And again, we can see there's not one reality about migrants and migration. It's just how, let's say, the media in this case plays a role in constructing or reconstructing a particular belief systems. The events themselves and the language and images that are used are never neutral, therefore. They're done in a way that we can see things in a more positive or negative light, and therefore we have to always think about why are things represented in a particular way. That's why when one talks about reading from a different range of news sources and so on is important, because there's not one truth according to post-structuralists. It's always any let's say, newspaper is created within a particular social space with particular normative commitments, political commitments, and you need to think critically about that and challenge even your own thoughts and belief systems. So deconstructing. So again, words are never entirely fixed, and even referring to, let's say, so to use a term like queer, and meaning odd or different or weird, positive, negative, whatever the case might be, referring to gay people or homosexuals as queer at one stage in a particular social political context, very derogatory, homophobic use. The gay rights movement in the 1960s, 1970s said, no, we will use a term like queer and we will embrace it. We will use it in an affirmative way. And therefore queer, we're going to use in a positive way, and we're going to socialize others in society to think of let's say, not only this term, but also what it means to be a gay or lesbian in a more positive light. And so the point I want to emphasize is that terms themselves can have at one stage a more negative or a more positive connotation, but they're not fixed once and for all. There's a flux that goes on with this. But again, when we think of the world, this complex world that we live in, when we talk about something as being civilized or barbaric, we have to think who's saying it, what's the context, is it entirely objective and factual? Actually, it's just emphasizing particular sets of values, and we have to think, what does that lead to? What does that create? What's the space? And can we critique it? Can we deconstruct it? And if so, how do we, let's say, respond to how political actors in this case might represent themselves as civilized and others as barbaric? This genealogical aspect of post-structuralism is important as well. To simplify how history matters, there's always a historical social space context of how certain, let's say, representations of a group of people have been given. I gave the example of homosexuality before. Once upon a time, it was seen as a mental illness. Thankfully, to give my own political normative commitments today, it's not seen as wrong. And of course, there's still homophobia in the world, and homophobia even in our own societies. But broadly speaking, there's a very, very, very different understanding of what it means of homosexuality today. But nonetheless, the discourse, the language and practices, even as late as the 1980s, to represent lesbians and gays is very different, let's say in Germany or the UK, to the 1980s to how it is now. And we can see how certain things were dominant. So you might have been condemned by many, thankfully not by all, but by many in the 1970s as mentally ill if you were gay. Today you are seen in a much different, and I do say, in a much more positive light. But nonetheless, this created a particular belief system amongst the general public. So how do certain constructions become dominant? Who does it benefit? Which actors benefit from constructing a particular belief system? And how does this come about? And it's never natural. It doesn't come from nature. So that how something becomes a social fact is always created in a particular social political space. Michel Foucault's work evolved over time, but as let's say different aspects of his work, we can look at it on a macro level, but we can also look at it on a micro level, how there's even, let's say, conflict, power relations between on a daily basis. So it doesn't have to be on a so macro scale when we're looking at international relations. It can also be done in how we refer to each other. Nonetheless, and this is the key point, power is created through language and practices and how we take things for granted. Power, therefore, is not just that I can get you to do something, but it's if you already believe in something, a particular discourse belief system, then I've already got a certain power in order to get you to do something. Why? Because you've already accepted it without me having to ask you to do it. The point is that and again, I want to re-emphasize this, that we have to think of how particular discourses were created historically, where they come from. So it's the opposite of being ahistorical. One has to look at how things are historically, we have to be historically informed and look at how things were created subjectively, whereby we then took them as objective, but nonetheless, they're not fixed once and for all. So there's abstractation. So we create a meaning in a particular social space. We represent a group of people. So if I represent a group of people, so racism, again, the horrible aspect of racism, representing a group of people in a particular light, in a particular negative light, that has implications. And as we know, it has horrible real life implications. And not just, let's say, in the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere. Interpreting and representing a group of people in a particular light reinforces, in this case, racism, certain prejudices. And so we need to be able to deconstruct it, challenge it, say, well, is it the case, or is it the case that certain political actors, social actors have created this in the first place? Where when spoke about this in a previous lecture, when we look at, let's say, how racism was constructed scientifically, in inverted commas, in the 19th century by various British, German, Italian, French biologists, anthropologists, to talk about hierarchy of race. Well, it was a construct. There's no such thing as a hierarchy of race. It was created, or I should say, as a brute fact. But in the social space, it was constructed, and to say that Europeans are at the top, etc., in this hierarchy of race, to create certain spaces. And we know the horrors, of course, of fascism and the Second World War, so we can see the evils of it. Hence, again, post-structuralist critical approach to say, why were certain things constructed? What did it lead to? And we can see it led to something very destructive. There's no such thing as something that's ready-made. We have to always interpret it. There's always an interpretation, there's always an observation of it, there's always different interpretations, and we have to convince ourselves and others of a particular approach to how we understand the world. Because epistemologically speaking, there's nothing outside. So post-positivism now, but post-structuralists here, they say that we have to look at how things are made possible, not why things happen, but how they are possible. And again, to use the term of social ontology, we are socialized within a particular space. And these ready-made categories, as I've mentioned before, are created in a historical, social, cultural space. We have to always, therefore, think how they create certain paths, how they create certain meanings and truths. But they're not fixed once and for all, but they are fixed for a period of time and create institutions until they're changed again. And again, what we're not saying is that everyone's claim to truth in the social space is the same. Of course, if someone's in a political space, in a more powerful position, he or she can create a meaning that, let's say, yours truly can't create. But what we are saying, what post-structuralists are saying, is that how certain interpretations become dominant, how certain meanings are created, this is something that we have to always be interrogating, always challenging. And this nexus of power and knowledge that Foucault and other important scholars, post-structuralist scholars, but also in IR's post-structuralism, Ashley, Walker, later on of David Campbell, Richard Jackson, Jutta Welders, etc. We have to look at how power and knowledge reinforces one another, and a relationship between language and practice, how discourse creates meanings and creates certain violence, and how it's very, very politicized. So some critiques of post-structuralism that I should emphasize here. Excuse me, I just wanted to so this is a critique that more mainstream approaches make towards post-structuralism, and this is the response from post-structuralists to say, hang on a second, calm down, I'm just going to put my image here so I myself can see all the points I've made. IR's first anxiety, and this is particularly made by mainstream theories like realism, liberalism, but even other approaches within, let's say, more mainstream constructivism and others also sometimes are critical of post-structuralists. First point is that post-structuralist is not interested in studying the real world. This is a critique of post-structuralism within the discipline of IR. Post-structuralist thought would say, well, by real in the social context, it's how it's been constructed. Again, what post-structuralists emphasizes, they're not saying that certain events didn't happen, that it was made up, but they are making the argument that these events, how they're interpreted, the meaning given to them is arbitrary, and the social spaces, it depends which actor is responding to which event. Secondly, that actually IR's discipline, particularly realism here, post-structuralist ignores key actors such as states. Well, post-structuralists would respond and they would say, actually, we're not ignoring states, but we're looking at a deeper level of, let's say, reality ontology, and we're looking at how these state structures are produced, how they were historically produced over time, Westphalian system, what have you, to use IR language, this Westphalian system, how it was produced historically and what it's meant for the world that we live in today, 2020, and going forward. Point 3 of IR's anxiety, post-structuralists believe that there is no reality outside the text. So it's all just, you look at the text, and so critiquing, it's just saying the text. What about, again, the real world? Well, in response, point 3, objects exist externally to thought, but their meaning is always constituted through this interpretation and discourse. When we look at political actors, the meaning they use, let's say by speeches, on Twitter, whatever the case might be, it creates a particular meaning. And this is very central to what, therefore, can possibly take place or does take place in the world. And fourth, post-structuralist is not interested in moral judgments. And there is a critique and how post-structuralist is seen as goes in circles, that it doesn't actually offer its own political normative commitments. Post-structuralist thought would say, actually, we have to always think, when we think of who's excluded, who's excluded, there's always an ethical component to post-structuralism, but it's basically making the case that we have to be careful because of all these other IR theories that we've come across. We don't want to fall into the trap of actually reproducing an order that is unethical. So post-structuralist response to a number of anxieties that the IR discipline has about post-structuralism. These are some of the responses. And now I want to put a point about identity and foreign policy. So again, everything is relational. There's a performance element. By language, through practices, we create institutions. We live in a post-Cold War world. We live in a post-9/11 world. We live in a world of whatever the case might be, a COVID world, whatever the case is, that's always relational. And we think, who are we, what are we doing, and how we are relating to others. But here again, when we look at, let's say, discursive practices, language and practices, but we are also always, by me always referring to, let's say, you as a good person, as an intelligent person, or I refer to you as a clown, or I refer to you as evil, to use this constructivist language again, by referring to it and reinforcing and going on about it in a particular way, it reproduces a particular approach that, let's say, your colleagues might see you. If I'm so influential, let's just imagine that for a moment, that is produced through me having influence in this case as a lecturer over other students. Therefore, other students will see you as an individual in a more positive or negative light, dependent on how I refer to you. The point being, this is what I want to emphasize here, is the realness, the reality of the situation is constantly interpreted and reinterpreted. And it's how things are justified, this justification. So when we look at, let's say, the Iraq War, or we look at about why invasion took place, or we look at trade barriers, protectionism between countries, the US and China, or a response to COVID-19, a whole host of other examples, when we look at, let's say, animal welfare in a particular society, whatever the case might be, each of these things, when it comes to international relations, or if we look at relations between different actors, state and non-state actors, and we look at, let's say, in the realm of foreign policy, how it can be non-state actors, particularly how state actors justify why they do what they do. So the Iraq War, you could say it's about oil if you're taking a Marxist approach, or if you're a realist, to be more powerful vis-a-vis other actors in the Middle East, whatever the case might be. But it's the justification we need to think about, how identity, how it's created, the justification, how it makes certain things possible. Therefore, we're not saying that there are not double standards in foreign policy. Sorry, post-structuralism is not saying that. They're saying you have to look at how things are justified and how that creates a particular meaning and whether it's accepted or not. And this is important. Identity, therefore, creates the interest through this social interaction. How one actor can be seen as a great threat or a danger one day, and then another day, to use colloquial English, this same actor can be seen in a more positive light. So meaning is always created through this discourse. And again here, and I want to just give you some sort of working definition, that discourse refers to a specific series of representations and practices through which meanings are produced, identities constituted, created, constructed, what have you, social relations established. And this is where the political and ethical outcomes become more or less possible. And again, I should emphasize this, through these language, representations, practices, there's always a relationship between language and practices. There's not a disconnect, there's a dialectical relationship. And it's not to say that everything is doom and gloom. There are also political and ethical outcomes that can actually be therefore deemed in a more positive light, but we just have to see how things are created. So if one looks at, let's say, the civil rights movement in the United States, 1950s, 1960s, or Nelson Mandela and the ANC throughout the Cold War, the apartheid white supremacist regime in South Africa, leading eventually to Nelson Mandela's release from prison and an eventual democratization of the society, it was a challenging of this hierarchy, meaning and discourse created by actors within South Africa, but of course other actors, non-state and state actors outside of South Africa, that challenged the apartheid regime. not all state actors, I should say. But the point was that the meanings and identity given to let's say, again, to use race as an example here, of black people in South Africa changed over time, and thankfully, from an ethical point of view, for the better, and eventually led to Mandela becoming president and South Africa as a country and society evolving. So, for example, states are made possible by this wide range of using language and discourse. So when we talk about when we have educational systems, when we think about, let's say, a national curriculum, whether we talk about Germany or Nigeria or Israel or Egypt or Brazil, the case is it creates certain policies, it creates certain ways of doing things. And again, whether it's military, whether cultural speeches made, economic investment, there's always this discourse, this language and practices that creates a particular approach that we as a society or as a state ought to take or not take. And hence, again, I refer to the educational system, that's why you have a national curriculum, to what it means to be, in my case, to use an example of what it means to be British. And this meaning has changed over time. And so when we look at, let's say, the British Empire, when I went to school, the British Empire was hardly covered, or let's say wasn't portrayed in any critical way. When I studied history at school, it was more or less studying kings and queens. And then you fast forward to the Napoleonic Wars. And then fast forward 100 years after that to the First and Second World War and the Cold War. And that's British political history for me, for my age group. Fast forward, let's say 20 years later, and it's not that the British Empire is seen as all bad and all etc., but there's a more critical approach that is starting to take place about the British Empire. So the same events now reinterpreted, critiqued. And this is when we look at, let's say, historians or political scientists, different schools of thought challenging the mainstream approach to something, to actually see if we can understand things in a richer way. So now, and I don't mean to say that there's a hugely critical approach to the British Empire in British schools when it comes to teaching history, but we can see how meanings that have been created on, let's say, the same actor, the British Empire, and how we see this particular political actor, again, the British Empire, how we can see that different generations or different approaches can deem a different understanding of the same actor or of the events themselves. So, and often we see this, and we in the global north, we have to protect the global south, and we can see through images. And again, it's not just about language post-structuralism. We also have to think about images and how we represent ourselves and how we represent others. So we in the global north, or we in the west, whatever term is it, that we often represent ourselves in one light, represent others in another light. You might hear, and you may even hear yourself saying it, but others saying it when they say people go traveling, particularly from Europe or the United States, and they go to a developing economy, a country. Just to use a random example, because I think of something that a family member, dare I say, once said to me about, she went to Ethiopia and how she said how lovely Ethiopia was. Great. I'm sure that's the case. But then she went on to say, well, the people are lovely. I want to learn from them. Great. I agree with that as well. But how they were simple and how they themselves were innocent, simple, and that we need to be more like them. Well, arguably, that sort of mindset, attitude is very patronizing to Ethiopian people and how they are complex, how they're not so simple, how they have a range of different ideas and belief systems. But it's also categorizing us as one way, as sophisticated, advanced, and them as something else. So problematic. And this is also done through photographs and how we often see it. So again, historically, empires, Europe, to use the post-colonial thoughts of, let's say, Europeans dressed and acting in a particular way and non-Europeans in another way, and so on. So civilized versus barbaric, West versus East, whatever the case might be. And we have to look at, again, with social media today, 2020, the images, broadcasting, news, newspapers, different images, we can see how things are represented. Disease, famine, war, death, these are real. These are real phenomenon, but how they are represented is also important. Who's responsible? How are they responsible? And so on. And there is this sort of and this is a historical context, being genealogical here, the context that the white man, the savior, this idea that you have that post-colonial and other critical approaches challenge, is that we have to save the others. We have to save those in the developing countries, rather than understanding that we, the so-called royal we in the West, may have created certain conditions for this hierarchy historically leading to the present. Not that the West is all responsible, but it has played a role. And also to simplify, let's say, the case of a famine. So famine itself, we know in and of itself is something hugely problematic, but there might be political factors. So in the case of Ethiopia, 1983 to 1985, there was a famine that took place. Many people dying. You could not argue it is the case, dying, needless deaths, horrible, disgusting deaths. But the point was, there was a political element going on. There were different groups within a particular society. There was a complexity that also played a role into why, let's say, suffering took place. But the point is how we represent, and of course, the role played by powerful countries, not only, let's say, within Ethiopia, but also outside. So the key point that I want to say is that it's often this case that, so we create a particular meaning representation. So we see here in this image of a boy suffering. In the case, you might say this image of whether it's from poverty, famine, whatever the case might be. And it's have to say that whether it's, let's say, aid agencies, charities, the United Nations, powerful countries in the global north, G7, G8, need to do something to help others. So Live Aid, again referring to 1984, 1985, the Ethiopian crisis, famine, and there was a political element to this as well. But Live Aid, so these musicians, Bob Geldof and Bono, organising many musicians in Great Britain, United States, raising a lot of money in 1985 to go to those who were suffering in Ethiopia, and what then became Eritrea. Antigua as well, all of this part of Northeast Africa. But the point was there was a highly political element to it. But the point here that I want to emphasize in terms of representation is that it's very often the case that we are representing ourselves in a particular way as we the savior, and they need us. They're innocent. They can't do much for themselves. They lack agency. And this is heavily problematic, because actually from a critical perspective now, it takes away the agency that people on the ground have to be protected. Now, what I'm not doing here is critiquing some pop stars for not understanding, let's say, the political context of the famine that took place in Ethiopia. And arguably, whether we're talking about Bob Geldof or Bono, there can be some good done in a particular context to provide aid, to provide money for different actors. What I'm trying to say here is, and this is the point I want to make, is that actually the way media, let's say, portrays a particular event and shows it is often the case of why, let's say, whether in the case of parts of Africa and elsewhere, why there is not agency for the people on the ground, but actually it's outsiders, often Westerners, who are, let's say, the ones who have agency, who create a better conditions by being active. And we therefore need to save others. And this is problematic according to post-structuralists. And this is why you should always challenge and think about how, let's say, images have been shot, why they've been shot, what they're meaning to represent, and whether they're actually helping people on the ground or not, whether it's giving agency to people on the ground or not. And so, again, we, the white man savior, to use colonialist discourse, colonial, we have to be very critical about who is us and who is them, how we can actually enable agency for people on the ground, whether in the case of Northeast Africa or wherever we're looking at it, the different actors, and how we're not just reinforcing, whether it's the case of Ethiopia in the 1980s or in Afghanistan post 9/11, certain political social structures, inequalities also within societies, how we can sometimes do more damage, post-colonial thought now, in engaging with a society rather than doing something positive. It's not to say that it's all doom and gloom, and that when we intervene, the West intervenes in another country, another context, can't do it. But it's just to be skeptical of what we're doing and how we're doing things. Why? Because often it can lead to you taking away agency of those on the ground. who are ultimately, for a society to prosper, so to speak, there needs to be agency within the society itself. And again, it was often this case that self and other, superiority and inferiority. So when we look at the world, we see ourselves as civilized and others as barbaric. And if we want to, let's say, in the Middle East or other parts of the world, we want to civilize, in inverted commas, certain parts of the world. And of course, that language is not always used explicitly, but they need to be a bit more like us. And then therefore they'll be good. They'll be doing things the right way. Well, it might be the case, but it also may well be the case that we're just, again, reinforcing certain value systems, belief systems that are not necessarily helpful for others, according to a post-structuralist approach. So what's the big idea, so to speak? Well, here I'm going to show you a round of three different points that I want to make. So we're always taking this critical approach to how things are represented and interpreted, and whether there's what are the alternative ways of understanding the same events, and how it can be done and thought about critically. Secondly, often post-structuralist thought, we're looking at archives, we're looking at images. So discourse analysis, we're looking at how meaning itself fluctuates, or content analysis, how meaning can be more fixed, but nonetheless, how meaning itself is created and reproduced over time. And we need to look at images, we need to look at speeches, etc., etc. And then this leads to the third point, how we challenge common sense assumptions about IR, how the public policy works, etc., etc., and how there's a relationship between each of these three points. And we have to always, therefore, be on the lookout and skeptical to some of the common sense assumptions of how the world is, because we have to think, how was it made historically? Where is it going to? What are these speeches? How do they make certain things possible? So it's more how possible rather than why. And by challenging it, deconstructing it, we can actually potentially have a political or ethical approach that actually lessens problems in this world rather than making them worse. So a couple of questions that I would like you to think about for in class. So I just read them out to you. The first one is, do you agree that it is a good idea to incorporate popular culture in the study of world politics? And popular culture, when we look at films, when we look at music, when we look at how groups are represented within a society, or other states are represented, and we look at, let's say, Hollywood films sometimes representing the United States, not always, but as a force for good, and then how, let's say, certain actors historically, whether we think of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, or the Arab world in the Cold War going into the 1990s, 2000s, or even China, how some of these actors are portrayed as bad, evil, the evil other, whatever the case, and how the US is a force for good. It plays a role, popular culture, and it plays a role also in how politics is done because of, again, this notion of representation, ideas, and so on. So think about how popular culture plays a role, and therefore think of popular culture and how its connection with world politics. And do you agree that it's a good idea to incorporate it? I won't say too much more, but arguably, from a post-structuralist point of view, there's no way that you can't incorporate it on some level. But anyway, I leave that thought floating, so to speak. And the other class question possibly would be, how do you see identity constituted in policies on immigration? And I referred briefly to this notion of identity and how it creates certain policies in immigration, who we see ourselves as us being a particular nation state, and them coming away to take our jobs, coming away to do A, B, C, D in a negative way, or we could think of it in a more positive way, to contribute to our society, to make our society enrich our society. Different ways of seeing the same phenomenon. So different ways of seeing the same events and interpreting, reinterpreting, etc. So thank you again for your attention. And again, we've covered a great deal of ground. We've now covered all the different theoretical frameworks, I'm delighted to say. We will be looking at ethics in the ninth presentation, and then we're looking at different issue areas, as we've already been touching upon different issue areas. But I just wanted to say that we've covered a great deal of ground, so I'm very, very happy about all of that and gone into a certain amount of depth. And so thank you for your attention, and I wish you, well, I'll see you in class.